She slapped a pregnant teacher in front of her principal, straightened her jacket, and walked out laughing. She had no idea what she had just started. Her name was Priya Osei, 33 years old, fifth grade teacher at Fairhaven Elementary School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She had been teaching there for 7 years. She arrived earlier than anyone else and left later than most. Her classroom walls were covered in her students' drawings. She believed children should see their own work up on the walls, so she put it there. Priya was 8 months pregnant. Her feet swelled by afternoon. Her lower back ached from the second hour of every school day. She kept a small cushion on her chair and a bottle of water on her desk. She did not complain to anyone. She just kept going. She remembered her students' birthdays. She noticed when someone went quiet. She called parents not only when there was a problem, but when something good had happened, just to say so. She was not celebrated for any of this. She did not ask to be. She showed up, she taught, she went home, and she came back the next morning and did it again. They would all learn to see her differently. Every one of them. Celine Morrow arrived at Fairhaven Elementary on a Thursday morning in October. She wore a camel-colored coat that cost more than the school's monthly supply budget. Her heels clicked against the hallway floor. Her rings caught the light. Her hair was perfect. She walked in as though the building had been expecting her. Her husband was Callum Morrow, 44 years old, co-founder of Elite Standards Capital, one of the most profitable private investment firms in the northeastern United States. His name was on the side of the new children's library 2 blocks from the school. His firm had donated heavily to the district's technology initiative the year before. Principal Ade Winters had shaken Callum Morrow's hand at a donor reception 6 months earlier and had not forgotten it. Celine knew what her husband's name did to rooms. She used it. She had come that morning because her son, a 10-year-old named Tate, had received a 42 on his social studies project. He had submitted work that was not his own. Priya had noted it on the paper with one plain sentence at the bottom. This work does not reflect Tate's voice or previous writing. Please resubmit. Celine read the note 3 times. She did not call the school. She had not emailed. She simply arrived unannounced at the school. Principal Winters met her in the front office. He offered coffee. He offered a seat. He said all the correct things. Celine waited until he finished and told him she needed to speak to the teacher. Immediately, Winters walked her to Priya's classroom. Through the narrow glass panel in the door, the students were visible, reading, heads bent over their books. The room was quiet. Priya was moving between desks. She paused at one to place a hand on a student's shoulder. She pointed at a line on the page. She murmured something. The child looked up and nodded. She was 8 months pregnant and it showed. Celine looked at her. Her expression did not change. Priya saw them at the door and held up one finger. She finished her loop of the room, gave a quiet instruction to the student nearest her, and walked to the hallway. She closed the door behind her. "Mrs. Morrow," Priya said. Celine did not offer a greeting. She held up Tate's graded paper. "You marked my son's project a 42. "Yes," Priya said. "I did." Celine's jaw tightened. "He worked very hard on that project." "I understand that," Priya said. "But the work he submitted wasn't written by him. I know his writing. This wasn't his. The resubmission window is open for 30 days. Celine looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled. "Are you accusing my son of cheating?" "I'm giving him a chance to resubmit," Priya said. "That's the policy. Do you know who my husband is?" Celine said. Principal Winters, standing slightly behind Celine, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Priya looked at her. "I know Tate is a bright kid who can do this work himself. That's what matters here." Celine's expression changed. The smile left. Something colder came through. She took one step forward. She raised her hand, and she slapped Priya across the face. The sound traveled down the hallway. Sharp. Wrong. Priya's head snapped sideways with the force of it. Her hands went to her stomach, both palms flat. Her back met the wall. She did not fall, but her eyes closed and her breath came out in one long, shaking exhale. Principal Winters made a sound but did not move. Celine straightened her jacket cuff. "You will remove that grade by tomorrow morning," she said. or my husband will make sure this district never sees another dollar of moral funding. She turned and walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked against the floor. At the end of the hallway, before pushing through the door, she laughed. Short and private. The door swung closed. Inside the classroom, through the narrow window in the door, a boy's face was pressed against the glass. He had heard the sound. He was looking out at his teacher. Priya stood with her hands on her stomach and her eyes closed. When she opened them, Winters was looking at her. Down the hall behind her, a second-grade teacher named Bev had stepped out of her classroom to refill a water jug. She had heard the sound. She stood 20 feet away with the jug in her hand, not moving. She looked at Priya's face. She looked at Winters. She looked at the door that had just swung shut. Winters turned toward her. "This is being handled," he said. Bev looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back into her classroom and closed her door. Winters turned back to Priya. He was sorry, he told her. Deeply sorry. But given the district's relationship with the Morrow family, perhaps they could revisit the grade. Perhaps there was a way to document the concern without the formal notation. He would look into the appropriate channels. But in the meantime, perhaps they could find a resolution that worked for everyone. Priya looked at him. A woman had just struck her in the face, in front of him, in a school hallway. He had been standing 5 feet away. He had watched her hands go to her stomach. He had heard the sound. And he was standing here now using the word perhaps. She said nothing. She went back into her classroom and closed the door. She finished the school day. She moved between desks. She checked comprehension. She answered questions. When a boy named Darius dropped his pencil and it rolled under the radiator and he couldn't reach it, she got down on one knee and got it herself, which took longer than it should have, and she handed it back without comment. At the end of the afternoon, she read to them the chapter they had been waiting for all week. 22 children leaning forward in their seats, some of them with their chins resting on their hands. One of them, a girl named Amaya who sat in the front row and noticed everything, looked at her teacher's face while she was reading. The mark was visible. It had already begun to darken. Amaya looked at it. Then she looked at the book in Priya's hands. Then she looked at the mark again. She did not say anything. She sat with it, the way children sometimes sit with things that are too big to ask about out loud. When the bell rang, they filed out with their backpacks and their noise. Priya sat at her desk in the empty room and put one hand on her stomach and breathed until the shaking stopped. The classroom looked the same as it always did at the end of a day. Chairs slightly askew. A book left spine up on a desk near the window. A drawing of a horse taped to the wall, one corner peeling loose. She had been in this room for 7 years. She knew every corner of it. She sat with her hand on her stomach and let the quiet settle. There was a red mark on her face. It would bruise by morning. She pulled out her phone and opened a number she had not called in 4 months. She held it for a while. Then she pressed it to her ear. He answered on the second ring. "Hey." His voice was low, unhurried. "You okay?" She said no. He was quiet for 2 seconds. "Where are you right now?" She told him. "Stay there," he said. "I'm coming." His name was Soren Osei, 36 years old. He had taken Priya's last name when they married. People who didn't know him were surprised by that. People who knew him were not. Most of Lancaster knew Soren as the man who ran the Osei Foundation. 8 years of building affordable housing, funding workforce programs, absorbing debt from families who had lost everything. 4 offices in Pennsylvania, an 18-month waiting list. Fewer people knew what was underneath that. He had sold 2 software companies before he was 30. The money did not live in his name. It lived in structures and instruments spread across multiple states. If you search for him in a financial database, you found the foundation. You did not find the rest. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru. Gray sweatshirt. 3 jackets in rotation. He coached his neighbor's kids' soccer team on Saturday mornings because the original coach had moved and somebody had to. His name was on no buildings. Callum Morrow had never heard the name Soren Osei. That was about to change. Soren arrived at Fairhaven Elementary 22 minutes after Priya called. He parked in the visitor lot and walked in. The front office receptionist looked up. He said he was there for his wife, Priya Osei. Her face changed. She had been at her desk when Celine Morrow walked past that morning. She had heard the sound. She looked at this man in the gray sweatshirt and said, "I'll let her know you're here." He waited in the hallway. He looked at the student artwork on the wall. Pencil drawings, crayon self-portraits, a papier-mâché solar system on a fishing line. Then Priya appeared at the end of the corridor. He sat on the edge of a student desk in her classroom, slightly too small for him, and looked at the mark on her face. He did not look away from it. He held her hand and listened. All of it. The grade, the hallway, the slap, the laugh. Winters and his careful suggestions about perhaps. When she finished, he nodded once. He asked how she was feeling physically, whether she'd had any cramping, whether the baby had moved. She told him yes. They were both fine. He kissed her once on the temple. "Stay here for a few minutes," he said. "I need to go talk to someone." He walked to Winter's office and knocked on the open door. Winters looked up. He saw the gray sweatshirt, the ordinary face, the 10-year-old car in the visitor lot. Nothing registered. "Can I help you?" he said. Soren sat down across from him without being invited to. "I'm Priya's husband. I'd like to understand what steps you're taking after what happened this afternoon." Winters shifted. He started his speech. Circumstances. The district's relationship with the Morrow family. The significance of their donations. Perhaps a mediated conversation going forward. Soren let him finish. "I want to make sure I understand," Soren said. "A woman struck my pregnant wife in a school hallway, and your response is to suggest changing the grade." Winter said it was more nuanced than that. "I'd like a copy of the security footage from this hallway today," Soren said. "I'd also like a formal incident report filed. And I'd like to know whether you've contacted the police." Winters blinked. He said he didn't think police involvement was, he paused, necessary. Soren looked at him. He looked at the framed photo behind Winter's desk of a school board ceremony. He looked at the certificate on the wall. He looked back at Winters. "The woman who did this," Soren said quietly, "hit my wife in front of you. You were standing right there." He let that sit for a second. "And your concern right now is the donation." Winters opened his mouth. Soren stood up. "Thank you for your time." He walked out. He made 3 calls from the parking lot beside the Subaru. The first was to Farida Ansa, his attorney. She had represented the Osei Foundation for 6 years. She listened for 90 seconds without interrupting. Then she said, "I'll file by morning." The second was to a contact at the Lancaster County District Attorney's office, to place the facts with a person who would remember having heard them. The third was to Kweku, the Foundation's head of communications, who handled the careful, factual, completely legal delivery of information to journalists who covered stories about institutional failure. Kweku asked one question. "How fast?" Soren said, "Let me see what they do in the next 24 hours. He went back inside and walked Priya to the car. She was quiet on the drive. He didn't push. They had been married 4 years, and he had learned that some things needed room before they needed words. He made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with her feet up and her hands around a mug of tea. The baby turned once, slow and deliberate. The red mark had deepened. He had looked at it twice and said nothing. "I keep thinking about the laugh," Priya said. "Not the slap. The laugh." He looked at her. "She hit me and then she laughed." Priya set the mug down. "She laughed because she thought it didn't matter. Because I didn't matter." She looked at her hands on the table. That's what the laugh was. It was her telling me that nothing was going to happen to her. That people like me don't have the kind of weight that makes anything happen to people like her. Soren did not rush to fill the space. Then he said, "She picked the wrong person to laugh at." Priya exhaled. She picked up the mug again. Principal Winters called at 7:45. His voice was thinner than it had been that afternoon. He told her the grade would stand. The incident would be formally documented. The school board had been notified. Priya thanked him and hung up. "Good," Soren said. "They're going to come at us," she said. "The Morrows. They're going to try." She looked at him across the table. "Are you sure about this?" "She slapped you in a school hallway in front of your principal," he said. She laughed on her way out. "Our daughter was 2 feet from that." He said it flat. "Just fact. I'm sure. Callum found out at 9:15 that same evening. His wife had mentioned it at dinner briefly. The great situation, she said. She had handled it. He did not ask how. By 9:15 his general counsel was calling. By 9:30 his publicist. By 10 o'clock he was sitting in his home office watching the Fairhaven Elementary security footage on his laptop. His wife, a pregnant teacher, a hallway, full force, a laugh on the way out. He watched it twice. He called his attorney. His attorney said the word lawsuit before Callum finished his first sentence. Then he said, "I've been trying to identify the husband's legal representation." He paused. "It's Farida Ansah." Callum knew that name. "Who is the teacher's husband?" he said. His attorney said he was still working on that. He found out the next morning. Soren Osei. He typed the name. He read everything. The foundation. The housing program. 8 years. No plaques. No profiles. Families with nowhere else to go and an 18-month line to see him. He sat back in his chair. He did not pick up his phone. He did not call anyone. He just sat there with the laptop open and the name on the screen. His wife had walked into a school and slapped a woman whose husband had spent nearly a decade building something for the most vulnerable people in this county. Not for press, not for positioning, because the need was there, and his wife had laughed on her way out. Callum Morrow had more money than Soren Osei. He understood now that money was not the field they were playing on. Celine came downstairs in her robe. Callum was at the kitchen table with his laptop and 3 phones. She poured coffee. He turned the laptop around and showed her the footage. She watched it. She shrugged. "I was provoked," she said. He stared at her. The woman was dismissive. "I reacted. It was a moment. You hit a pregnant woman in a school," he said. "It's on camera." 2 regional outlets picked it up overnight. Celine's face shifted, not into remorse. "We donate to this district," she said. "We have leverage." Their attorney filed a civil suit at 8 this morning, Callum said. Assault, emotional distress, damages to the employment environment. There's a criminal complaint with the county. Silence. Her husband is Soren Osei. Something changed across Celine's face. He watched her recognize the name. He watched her understand, in real time, what she had walked into. Because even Celine, who curated her world carefully, had heard of the Osei Foundation. She had attended a benefit the previous spring. She had written a check. She had shaken a hand. She had never connected that name to a person she might one day need to think about carefully. She set her coffee cup down. "It was a slap," she said. Callum closed the laptop. "You slapped a pregnant teacher in a school hallway in front of her principal. And then you laughed." He looked at her. There were 6 children who were visible through the classroom window when it happened. The school has a trauma counselor already scheduled. She said nothing. "I cannot make this go away," Callum said. "This is not a story we can manage. This is a woman with a child, a camera, an attorney, and a husband who has spent 8 years building goodwill with people in this county who never forget who helped them when they had nothing." He took a second. "He has more of that than we have money." Nobody spoke. That was the sentence that landed. Not the lawsuit. Not the footage. "He has more of that than we have money." Celine did not speak. Priya was back in her classroom Friday morning. The union representative had called. 2 colleagues had left food on her doorstep. She had replied to every message. Then she had gone to sleep, and in the morning she had come back. Her students noticed the bruise. Children always notice. Amaya sat in the front row and looked at her teacher's face the moment Priya walked in. She had been sitting with what she saw the day before. The mark, the book in Priya's hands, Priya reading to them anyway. She had not told her mother about it the night before. She had not known how to start. Now she looked at the bruise and raised her hand. She put it down. Then she raised it again. "Ms. Osei," she said, "does it hurt?" The room went silent. 22 children looking at their teacher. Priya looked at Amaya. For just a second, 1 second, something crossed her face. Not tears, not a collapse, just the smallest fracture in the composure she had been carrying since yesterday afternoon. There and gone in less than a breath. "Not anymore," Priya said. She picked up the book from her desk. "Let's start where we left off yesterday." The week moved. The case was filed. The regional story became a state story. The footage was clear. a school hallway, a pregnant teacher, a laugh at the end. People watched it and felt something specific and sharp. Comment sections filled up. Shares multiplied. The story traveled the way stories travel when they touch something that has no name, but everyone recognizes. Teachers shared it. Parents shared it. People who had never been to Lancaster, Pennsylvania shared it with a single sentence, "Watch until the end." Nobody outside the school knew yet who the husband was. That was still coming. The Moral Foundation issued a statement saying they deeply regret what happened. They called it a private matter and said it's being handled, reaffirming their commitment to the community. Kweku texted Soren. They hired a crisis firm. 4 hours late. Soren replied, "Let Farida handle the rest." He was at soccer practice. He finished the session before he checked his phone again. 2 weeks later, Celine Morrow sat across from Farida Ansa in a conference room in downtown Lancaster. 2 attorneys beside her. She had dressed carefully. Farida opened a folder and placed a single photograph on the table. A still from the security footage. Time-stamped and clear. Celine's hand mid-motion. Priya's head turned by the force of it. Both of Priya's palms already moving toward her stomach. Farida said nothing for a moment. She let Celine look at it. Celine's attorneys leaned in. One of them whispered something. The other wrote a note on his pad. Then Farida laid out the terms. The civil settlement was substantial. A formal public apology, written and signed, published in the county paper and through the district's communications. A conflict resolution program for every parent in the district who wanted it, funded by Celine personally, running 3 years. A direct donation to Fairhaven Elementary's resource fund, unrestricted, irrevocable. And a letter to the district. Tate's grade was not to be reconsidered, altered, or contested by anyone connected to the Morrow family. Ever. Celine's attorney whispered in her ear. She looked at the photograph on the table for a long time. Then she looked away. She signed. The criminal matter was handled separately. A formal charge. A diversion program. Community service hours at a women's shelter in Harrisburg, where she was not permitted to say who she was or why she was there. She filed intake paperwork. She stocked shelves. On Thursday mornings, she made sandwiches in the communal kitchen. One Thursday in the second month, a woman came through the serving line with a small girl on her hip. The girl was maybe 3. She had mismatched socks and a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. The mother asked if there was extra juice for her daughter. Celine looked at the girl. She poured the juice. She held it out. The girl took it with both hands and said thank you in the careful, deliberate way of a child who has been taught to say it and means it. The mother moved on down the line. Celine stood there with the empty cup in her hand. She did not put it down. She did not move to the next person. Her hand just stayed there, holding nothing, for a moment longer than made sense. Then she set it down and reached for the next one. By the 3rd month, she stopped wearing her rings on Thursday mornings. Nobody asked her to. She did not laugh. Not once. Priya returned to teaching the Monday after the agreement was finalized. The classroom arranged, windows cracked because the room kept good air when they were open. Bev was in the hallway when Priya arrived that morning. She had a new water jug. She looked at Priya when she passed and said, "Good morning." Her daughter was born on a Tuesday in November. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. A full head of hair and lungs that announced her arrival to the entire floor. Soren held her. He stood with the baby against his chest and looked at her face and did not speak for a long time. Priya watched him. "She's very loud for such a small person," Priya said. He laughed. "I wonder where she gets that." Priya smiled. Tate Morrow resubmitted his project. He submitted it on a Friday, the last day of the window. Hand-delivered to the front office in a manila envelope with his name on the outside. No parent note. Just the work. He wrote it himself. It was awkward in places. There was a paragraph in the middle where he changed direction and then came back, as if he had started to say something and thought better of it. He left it anyway. Priya gave him a 78 and wrote one sentence at the bottom. "This is your voice. Keep using it." She meant it. She meant everything she wrote on her students' papers. Amaya made a card for Ms. Osei when the baby was born. She drew the baby with a very large amount of hair. Accurate, and wrote at the bottom in careful pencil, "We are glad your baby came, and we are glad you are still our teacher." All 22 students signed it. There are people in this world who look at a quiet person and decide they are looking at someone who will not push back. They see the patience and the years of showing up, and they think, this one will absorb whatever I do to them. They are wrong. They are always wrong. The quietest people in a room are not without power. They have simply not yet decided it is worth spending. When they decide, everything changes. Priya Osei decided. And the woman who had laughed while walking out of that hallway stood in a shelter kitchen every Thursday for 6 months, pouring juice for children she did not know, in a city where nobody knew her name. And somewhere in Lancaster, the card was still on the desk. The drawings were still on the walls. The bruise was gone. The daughter was home. The windows were cracked just enough. And 22 children leaned forward as their teacher turned the page. The classroom was quiet. She began. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If you are a teacher, share this today. If you have ever been underestimated, share this today. If you know someone who keeps showing up quietly and never gets enough credit, send it to them right now. They need to see it. And we want to know you are here. Drop your city or your country in the comments. Whether you are in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Canada, the United Kingdom, South Africa, Jamaica, the Philippines, Australia, or anywhere else in this world, let us know. We read every single one. Subscribe for more stories like this one. We will see you in the next one.